Dr. Cassie Hudson has spent nearly a decade helping nonprofits and educational institutions turn messy data into meaningful decisions. 6 years of using Metabase makes her perhaps the most experienced customer I've ever met. She's most recently on the fundraising analytics team at Wikimedia Foundation. And with that, I will hand things over to Cassie and bring her up here onto the stage and slides. And there we go.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. So my name is Cassie Hudson, and I'm representing the fundraising department at the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the nonprofit that supports all Wikimedia movement projects, most commonly known as Wikipedia. And today we're going to talk about lowering the friction to insight and the steps that we've taken to build self-service analytics at the Wikimedia Foundation. We're going to hit a few different points here. First, just briefly talking about what is self-service, and then a quick look at the things that have changed at the Wikimedia Foundation in the last couple of years. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about the steps that we've taken to actually design for self-service. So here we're looking at a few different elements of a strong self-service data culture. The four elements that I have here are first guidance. So in providing guidance to your stakeholders instead of gatekeeping, by creating certified data sets, approved metrics, and guiding your stakeholders with permission layers. Second, having good data accessibility, where your data is designed for humans and not just the analyst kind, with business-friendly table names using consistent column naming conventions, and having accessible documentation with descriptions and query examples. We'll also have data literacy as an important component, ensuring a basic shared level of data literacy across your organization for all your stakeholders, supported with processes like internal data training, office hours, and onboarding materials. And then finally, it's important to have a strong data foundation that creates a single source of truth for important metrics, and of course is supported by reliable data pipelines and well-modeled analytics-ready tables. So all of these are important elements of creating a strong self-service data culture. And then the two that I feel like Metabase can really help with are improving data accessibility for sure, and then also creating a framework to provide guidance to stakeholders. Moving on, just a quick glimpse into a little bit about what has changed in our data stack at the foundation in the last couple of years. So we've actually transformed really dramatically. A couple of years ago, our data stack was much like an old school traditional stack where we had Python scripts that were running SQL queries that were orchestrated by cron jobs. And now we've switched to incorporating a lot more tools, including Trino is our query engine against MinIO for object storage, using dbt for data transformations, and Dagster for orchestration, and then also adopting Metabase as our reporting layer. So I won't spend much time on all those other elements, but everything outside of Metabase is really important for building that strong data foundation that I mentioned, because your stakeholders need to be able to run queries that execute in a reasonable amount of time. So whatever your upstream data stack needs to be able to handle whatever traffic you're sending to it. And your transformation layer, in our case dbt, needs to be flexible enough to adapt to any, to evolve to meet your stakeholders' needs. So, but today I'll really be talking about what Metabase can help you accomplish. So again, designing for self-service, moving into this section of the presentation, which is where I'll spend most of the rest of our time. So first, one of the things that I love about Metabase, and you may notice the first time you launch an instance of Metabase, is it has a very minimalist aesthetic. And that really enables you to work with your stakeholders to establish a query and dashboard management system that's reflective of how your stakeholders think about their work. So on the slide here, I have two different screenshots. One is showing our collection hierarchy, which again is going to have collections generally correspond to different teams or lines of business at the organization. And then the other screenshot is showing snapshot of what you might see in the admin view at Metabase of your Metabase instance, where you're able to manage permissions at the highest level for individual collections, which are the folders that you see here, or individual tables, though there's even more granular permissions that you can get into from there. Once you have that set up, people know where to go to look for things. It's important to, as you're feeding data into Metabase, anything that's consumed by your stakeholders is accessible in terms of how everything is named and set up there. So the two that I've emphasized here are tables and columns. So some tips for tables, as I mentioned before, like corresponding your tables to business concepts. So an example in my case, not at the foundation, but other places I've worked, our transactional database had our donations data. The table was named receipt, and not just receipt, but RCPT. So that's not something that you would want to share with your stakeholders. They don't refer to their to donations as receipts, so that would be very confusing for people to look at. So you'll want to rename and, of course, transform those tables as well to reflect business concepts. Some other things, just spelling out full words, avoiding special characters, avoiding database lingo that unless everyone at your organization is familiar with like DIM and FACT and things like that, you're not necessarily going to want to expose that into your reporting layer. Another thing that I've seen differences on is like use an S on your tables or don't. So whether you want donation or donations, I don't have strong opinions about that. But the important thing is to keep things consistent and to help your stakeholders imagine that a record in this particular table represents one instance of whatever the table name is. So if you have a donation table and you're looking at a record of that table, I, as a stakeholder, should be able to say that this record is one donation. And then moving into columns, a couple of tips I have there as well. I recommend always naming the primary key as ID, and then any foreign keys on that table would be named the foreign table underscore ID. And always keeping that consistent will help your stakeholders and honestly your analysts understand what each column represents in a given table. For the most part, your stakeholders, most of them will probably not necessarily be learning how to join and understanding the relationship diagram of your reporting database. That's probably not going to happen for most people, but informing them of these different practices can at least get them to the point where if they're looking at the donation table and they see a foreign key record, which might be something like organization ID, they know if they go to the organization table, they'll be able to see that primary key of that organization in that organization table, even if they're not necessarily joining. A couple of other column types. So for date-time columns, I think using conventions like created at, received at, things like that is a bit more intuitive. But if you want to do something like created date time or received date time, that's fine as well. But again, just keeping that consistent throughout for your stakeholders. And I also think that with Boolean fields, naming it so it's obvious what's true is also a good practice. So for example, instead of just using restricted gift, you might name a field is restricted gift. So now that we have all of our well-named tables and columns, you're going to need to document everything. So your tables can have descriptions, your fields can have descriptions. If you're using metrics in Metabase, those can have descriptions. If you're building dashboards and queries, those can have descriptions. But focusing just on the back end right now, so columns and tables in particular. So the images that I have on the screen here, it's actually a snippet from a DBT YAML file and an illustration of what that would look like to an end user if they opened the notebook editor and hovered over one of the columns, in this case, upgrade status and fiscal year. So if you are using DBT, then it's pretty straightforward to get any column descriptions into Metabase as well. Some data warehouses will handle this automatically. Others, like in our case, you might have to or want to use a package like DBT Metabase. With DBT Metabase, you can do a lot more than just propagate your field descriptions. You can also set display names, for example. On the screen, I'm showing a display name for that particular column. We prefer to use sentence case. as opposed to title case that you would see in Metabase. So that lets, or by default anyways, that would let you propagate that view into all of your columns programmatically. And you can also enforce column ordering based on your YAML files, set data types, and also set foreign key relationships, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So another great thing about Metabase that really provides a lot of utility for stakeholders is if you set up your foreign key relationships in the table metadata, then that's going to give access to each of those tables in the notebook editor view for your stakeholders. So the example that I have here on the screen, we are querying the donations table, but when you drop down into that filter view, you can see that there are several other tables as well that you can open and use those columns for filtering and summarization, all without ever having to do any joins. It doesn't mean that there are no cases that you would need to join tables if you're using the editor and you set up all your foreign key relationships, but it definitely helps in a lot of cases. I have another image on the screen there that shows of generating a surrogate key. So if you're building a custom table, you might not necessarily have a primary key and foreign key that you can use to link two tables together. And in that case, you can generate something like a surrogate key. If you're using DBT, you can use DBT utils, the generate surrogate key macro to combine columns in order to create those unique identifiers across different models. But you can do that in other SQL dialects as well if you're not using DBT. So that enabled us to, for our custom campaigns table, to create that unique identifier and a foreign key for it on donation, so we can have that relationship established in Metabase. Moving on from data accessibility, we're going to talk just briefly on how you can use Metabase to provide guidance to your stakeholders. So definitely they'll be able to start querying data independently once you have all of your data set up and accessible for people via the editor or whatever tools you're providing to them. But you're still going to want to have dashboards for stakeholders in Metabase as well. Some people, if you've provided that access for them, will get in and start making dashboards immediately with very little training. And then other people will need a bit more support with that. So as you're starting to design dashboards, I prefer a more collaborative approach. So we're building these resources together to help your stakeholders understand the data better and also really understand how to use the tools that have been designed for them. So here are a few different practices for building dashboards collaboratively. The first thing is establishing a smaller working group of individuals. A lot of times when you're designing a dashboard, you are going to have more than just a couple of people that are going to want to use that dashboard after it's complete, but it can be really difficult to work with that entire group of people. So having a group of 2 to 3 key stakeholders can be really helpful during the design process. And then being sure as well that those handful of people can also commit enough time to provide guidance throughout that process. I usually recommend something between 4 to 8 hours across the amount of time that you're going to be designing the dashboard, so they can help field questions for you. They can provide feedback. They can review the tool with you, any meetings that you need to have. And then either with that small group of individuals, or if you want to bring it back to the larger group as well, you can build a paper prototype. Some people really engage with like actually drawing things out how they'd like to look. It's a little bit more difficult in our virtual environment. So it's also possible just to generate a list of things that people are interested in seeing on a dashboard. Or again, if you're working with that larger group, you can do something like a brainwriting exercise where you pose a few questions to people and then they write out their responses on Post-it notes that you can get some consensus with. So for example, you might be looking for pain points in a process that they're working with or things that they would be interested in seeing on a dashboard. And once you have all of that consolidated, then I recommend having a more written list of queries and filters and tabs where you can engage with your stakeholders collaboratively. So I have over here on the screen a Google Doc where we know that we want to see the average donation size shown as a number. And so I have the query linked for that. And then I'm continuing to engage with those stakeholders in that document. What additional filters might you want to apply here, XYZ, and we can have that conversation before we put everything onto the dashboard. Because once you put everything onto the dashboard, it's more difficult to collaborate, and there's also more steps involved after that than there is to just build a simple query, because you're arranging it on the dashboard, you're making it look nice, and you're giving people more things to focus on when really you need to focus on making sure that your queries are correct. Once you have all that done, feel free to build your dashboard, get some feedback from your small stakeholder group, your larger stakeholder group, and develop some documentation for that tool, whether that's written or recorded, and make sure it's accessible from the dashboard. And then my last tip here, again, data literacy. It's something that'd be great if we all came in with it. We all knew how to work with Metabase, but for the most part, this is going to be a new tool for a lot of people. And so I recommend having a general basic training for everyone. I have a snippet of some objectives that are in our Metabase 101 is what we call it. And just ensuring that all people that are going to be working with Metabase have access to that, and developing some more in-depth training for people who want to go a little bit further. So to sum it all up, here are the different things that we've talked about today to build a strong service data culture. And the two that I really feel like Metabase can help with best are great data accessibility and providing guidance to your stakeholders. Where we are right now at the foundation, we have built a really strong data foundation, and we're working hard on improving our stakeholders' data literacy and continuing to provide guidance with our Metabase products. So that is all for me, and I will take any questions that you have now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been really interesting. And I have to ask you something that I find really fascinating about what you talked about, which is that your approach of starting with a document rather than the dashboard. And I'm really curious how you came up with that and how people respond to that. Like, do you see people responding differently to a document versus just like being shown a dashboard or like the sketches of a dashboard?
Yeah, so I think probably coming up with that, it evolved from trying to engage with people on all of these different queries and elements, and just not really being able to do that on the dashboard itself. So, and then it kind of just naturally evolved into going to a place where you could engage on that. So whether that's, I think Google Docs for us works well because that's the product that we use. And then one of the things that I notice when people look at a dashboard, especially if they're looking at it live and you've made everything pretty, it looks like it's done. And so there's usually a lot more engagement that needs to happen after that. And just having it connected like to each individual element of the dashboard, like you can do in a document, I think is really helpful for that. And as far as how people have responded to it, I'm relatively new to the foundation. I've only been here for about a year now. So I think that that's something that people are adapting to. It feels a little bit new. At the last place that I worked, we had gotten to a place where I think people were really receptive to it and understood the process. And after they had gone through the process with me, understood the value of it, because there was so much dialogue that had to go into just deciding exactly how to represent a piece of data that would reflect exactly what they needed to know.
Yeah, fascinating. That's really interesting. Okay, and then a question that just came in here is, can you talk more about basic data literacy? What level of literacy do you target, and what do you sort of like expect, I guess, from people?
Yeah, you bet. So I I think that that will vary in your stakeholder group. There are definitely people who will want to go to higher points. Where I try to get as a basic level for all of the stakeholders in the organization is that they understand the basic functionalities of Metabase. So when I say basic functionalities, that's going to be for me anything that doesn't involve joins, anything that doesn't involve custom expressions, but they know how to open the editor, filter a table, do summarization, filter a dashboard, drill down into a question. They know how to do all of those things at a basic level. And then from there, we'll also have team-specific trainings, and those are really less targeted toward how do I use Metabase and more targeted to what data is available to me, how do I understand it, how can I ask questions with it. And so that is less about general data literacy and more about what is unique about the data at your organization. So we'll have that as well. And then as kind of a capstone for those people who are, I would just call it Metabase super users, that's when we start teaching things like custom expressions, joins, and things like that in Metabase. I've never, maybe once or twice, gotten to the point where people are like, I want to write SQL, help me write SQL. So that is really rare. So I don't have a framework for that necessarily. But for the most part, we try to transform our data upstream in DBT to an extent where people aren't needing to write SQL. But there are like rare cases where I've like tutored people one-on-one who want to do that. But generally people, like our general stakeholders, don't actually have access to write SQL in our Metabase instances.
Interesting, yeah. Great. And so I think your colleague already answered some of those questions in the chat, but is any of this data embedded on Wikipedia or publicly available for people to see?
Our data?
Yeah.
I'm not sure how my colleague responded in the chat. I haven't seen that yet, but not the fundraising data, not directly. We do have reports, of course, as all nonprofit organizations do with our fundraising data, but there's not anything that you could access and query directly for fundraising.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that these are all the questions I can find right now. I really appreciate you doing this. This was really interesting, and I think we all learned a lot about how to approach building better dashboards from your talk. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you.